So now I am very happy to introduce my good friend and everyone's favorite translator, Thupten Jinpa, who has wonderfully come out now with his own book after many, many years of serving His Holiness and editing so many of His Holiness's books. And he is going to read, you're going to talk a little bit, are you, and then read from the book. And I'm particularly happy because as a fellow translator, we had an event last fall where Jimbala had to read from my translation, which was a real suffering for him, because translators do suffer when they have to read a translation with other translators' terminology. It's like somehow, because the words they're used to using are the words, and the other guy's stuff are her, whatever. And he did it very bravely, but at the end it brought him to tears. Which was a moment of triumph, I thought, really, and Tsongkhapa's famous poem at the end. I really thought it was marvelous. And I look forward. Actually, I got His Holiness in India just now. I want to call you Rinpoche, and you are really a Rinpoche for all of us. There's no question about it. And you remind me of Geshe Jambal Tarda, who used to teach at Virginia, and Paul Hackett told me the story that at one point his students who were feeling very devotional, they said, well, Geshe-la, you know, you're such a wonderful teacher and you're so much, how come you're not a Rinpoche? And he said, well, I wanted to be, but all the good ones were taken. Which I think is really quite wonderful. But someone can be a Rinpoche by their attainment and achievement in this life. And I was touched reading the beginning of your book about your own saga and your uncle wanting you to stay in the little monastery there, and you're breaking away and being American and rebellious and so forth. And I'm sure there are many more things in the book that I haven't gotten to yet, which I look forward to doing. And so that's all. And we wish you the best of luck. You're dealing with the popular publishing in America and book tours and TV and things. And I hope it goes. We all are rooting for you. We hope it goes really well. And we're very honored that you came to Tibet House to do this. And sorry that it turns out to be an evening where we don't have the whole evening, or we'd spend much more time. Okay? So without that introduction, Thupten Jinpa. Okay?
Thank you, Bob. You know, many of you know who Bob Thurman is. I remember as a young monk in 1971, I think, I remember everybody was excited about this American Buddhist monk. It was Bob, it was Bob Thurman. And for many Tibetans who speak English, Bob has a very, very special place in our heart because, you know, he has been a really a powerful voice of advocacy for the Tibetan right and Tibetan culture and the need to appreciate what Tibet and its classical tradition has to offer to the larger world. His book, Why the Dalai Lama Matters, was, I think, a very, very important publication, really putting squarely the role that His Holiness can play in bringing peace in the larger part of the world, you know, to a much larger audience of readership. So, you know, thank you, Bob. It's been a real honor to be introduced by you. And in the Tibetan tradition, seniority matters, and Bob is a senior translator. So, so my respects to you. And I would like to thank Tibet House as well for really very generously hosting this event. I've published several books, but the why I'm particularly attached, even though as a Buddhist I shouldn't be too attached, why I'm particularly attached to this book is that this is effectively my first book for the general public. And I thought it would be nice to have a little informal get-together of friends and sort of congratulate each other and be part of a celebration, you know, to have a kind of a nice starting, a kind of a send-off. In Tibetan tradition, if there is one superstitious belief that even I share as a critical Tibetan, is that we take seriously what we call auspiciousness. So when we do things need to be auspicious right at the beginning so that everything will go smoothly. So that's why I really wanted something like this. And it so happened that the timing was perfect for the official release of the book as well. And so I would like to thank Tibet House, everybody who have worked for this. And some of you have enjoyed the delicious momos. They're actually prepared by my family. I have quite a large family here in, not immediate, but cousins in New York. And they do all sorts of interesting things. One of them is a yellow cab driver. My cousins are there. One of the musicians is a son of one of my cousins. So, and they love America. I mean, like, my sister is an American, and she loves America. And it's really a real testament to the greatness of this nation to really make immigrants feel that they are completely accepted. And so I wanted to take this opportunity to not only thank my family members, but also thank U.S. for giving this second home to the Tibetans. Before I begin my very brief remarks, I also wanted to thank my publisher, Hudson Street Press and Penguin Group, for very generously donating 100 books so that all the guests here, as you leave, you can pick up your free copy. But although Penguin very generously donated the books, I have one condition, which is each of you who get a free copy of the book, please buy a copy and give it to a friend or a family member. So, so we have a lot of people here in this room that has been really instrumental in making this book possible. First and foremost, I have Stephanie Tate, my book agent, literary agent, and although compassion is a topic that I wanted to write about for quite a while, but I never really got the courage to actually, think big and think at the level of general readership. And Stephanie was really very, very instrumental in making this possible. My publisher, Carolyn Sutton, is here from now Avery Books. And if ever any writers here get Caroline as a publisher, you are very blessed. She has what I would call the fierce compassion. Had it not been for Caroline, I think I would have succumbed to complacency and not moved on to that extra level. And and Caroline's publicist team is here, Louisa, Brianna, they're also here. And there's also one person who was really important for making that extra last final step to make the book read less like written by a foreigner and more like written by a native English speaker. And that is Stephanie Hicks. And actually, I'm meeting her for the first time, although I worked with her very closely, and we didn't even Skype, so I didn't know how she looked like. So, so I wanted to take this opportunity to thank all of you. Now, the question is, why compassion and why by me? I genuinely believe that the time for compassion has really come. Until recently, in the West, particularly in the scientific domain, emotions in general, and particularly the positive emotions, were not taken seriously because they were just too nebulous. They just can't get a handle on. And also in the larger narrative of who we are as species, which frames scientific understanding of human nature, there wasn't much place for something like compassion and altruism. The narrative of human story was dominated by survival of the fittest, aggressiveness, competitiveness, and pursuit of self-interest. But now, thanks to many different factors, one of which I would really acknowledge is His Holiness's constant advocacy of compassion as a powerful motivating factor in the world. And he has been, bringing this message in addition to peace for over almost 5 decades of his travel across the world. And I suppose the world is a bit more receptive to that kind of message. Then there was this coincidence of mindfulness revolution that we saw where, thanks to many people, particularly John Kabat-Zinn's work, who's a fellow board member on the Mind and Life Institute, where a particular integrated practice was created that has taken the actual practices out of the specificity of a particular Buddhist cultural language into a more universally accessible format and offered it to the world, initially as a pain management, and gradually, as it caught on, now in the clinical domain and increasingly in the wellness and well-being domain, and now in education as well. So mindfulness movement really showed us that when the best of the contemplative practices are brought together with the best of the rigors of science and clinical application, there is a genuine offering to the world. And I believe, and the other thing that has made a big difference is the revolution in science, particularly in the brain imaging technology, where for the first time we have much more sophisticated instrument to peer into the brain, to look at brain in function, as it were. So all of these have really now made it possible for something like compassion, which is more complex than mindfulness, to really be taken seriously. Firstly, as part of our human nature. Secondly, as an important part of our motivation system. And thirdly, an area where we could do something. We can cultivate compassion. And this is where I was fortunate to be able to work at Stanford, which gave me the opportunity to produce something, a kind of a similar to MBSR type, practice on compassion. And all of this, gave me the opportunity to think about seriously writing a book. Now, I'm still not convinced I may be the best person to do it, but why not? I could be one among the possible candidates, who could do something like this. And, for me, it's been a real privilege, to be able to do this. I have to admit it was a challenge. The writing was a challenge. I'm not used to writing at that general level. Writing was a challenge. But when I've completed it and when the book was going to be printed, I really felt good about this. Because I genuinely believe that compassion is a quality of human nature that many of us don't tap into enough. Because for me, the beauty of compassion is that it offers us a way of dealing with situations in our own life and difficulties in relationship with others, where we bring the best of ourselves. For most of us, normally we leave compassion at the level of reaction. When it's triggered by sight of suffering, we feel compassionate, and we just leave it at that. What the compassion training idea suggests is that we can actually make compassion a proactive stance, an attitude, a perspective from which we relate to the world. So in some sense, compassion can be the philosophy of our life. And also, so that compassion just does not remain at the level of emotion, which is triggered when we are confronted with a situation, but actually becomes a state of mind, a mindset from which we relate to the world. So, and then we have a completely different way of dealing with the world. Another thing, the beauty of compassion is that it really offers the best moral compass. When we are in a difficult moral situation, the most wise question to ask is, what is the most compassionate thing to do here? And if the situation requires toughness and firmness, if the compassion calls for it, that's the right response. So for me, compassion is not just an ideal. Compassion is a real force. And this is the message I was trying to bring in my book. And I'm not going to read, I'll just read one section, and and then we will stop, because we have another event here, so we need to leave the room around 6:30. So to conclude, let me quote from the book. Throughout these pages, we have repeatedly acknowledged how we are, by very nature, empathetic creatures, how we humans have an amazing ability to connect with others, to get into other people's shoes and minds. In the face of someone else's needs and pain, we instinctively respond with kindness, understanding, and care. We do not need religion or schooling to teach us this. Each of us instinctively longs for connection with others. We crave others' affection, their affirmation, and their assurance. Even our experience of happiness and suffering, which defines us as sentient, is profoundly shaped by our relationship with others. These are the fundamental facts of our human condition. This said, whether we make empathy and compassion guiding forces in our life is clearly a matter of choice, individual as well as societal. The way we see ourselves and the world around us, the attitudes we bring to the world, the values we cherish, and the action we take all determine whether or not compassion plays a defining role in our life. Compassion training connects us with the kinder part of our nature, but if we are not in the habit of compassion, it will take some intention, determination, and practice to make it our default position and organizing principle of our life. So the goal of cultivating compassion is both ambitious and radical. It is to transform our very being and profoundly change how we behave in the world. This is true spiritual transformation. So before I conclude, I would like to thank everybody for taking the time to be part of this celebration. We have also very old friends from Mind and Life Institute. I noticed board members, and also Jackie is here, the development director. And one of the things that Mind and Life has given me is a real, opportunity to learn about science. If I know anything about science, it's really thanks to my being part of the Mind and Life family. So I particularly thank, the Mind and Life family members who are here as well. Thank you. So I think I'll take one or two questions, and then as you leave, because we have to leave the room by 6:30, the books are out there. And maybe if you have still some drinks and food, can you bring in? Kala kish. And then we will maybe few questions. Yes.
There are lots of reasons why we lose sight of that. So if there's one technique that you could share with us and help us remember.
One of the things that I personally find really helpful from the Tibetan tradition, and that it's brought in the book, is conscious intention setting. And part of the monastic training in the Tibetan tradition is that every morning when we wake up, we consciously set the intention to spend this particular day in a particular way, meaningful way, and bringing compassion as part of that conscious intention. That I think is important, because in a sense you are constantly reinforcing your appreciation of compassion as a key value. And over time it becomes, because you're able to remember. Because for example, the reason why the monks take so many precepts is to remind you. Precepts are like shorthands, and the monks on a regular basis review the precepts so that when you're confronted with a challenging situation, you're able to recall. And that was, in fact, originally the primary purpose of mindfulness practice. It was to connect your immediate, awareness with recollection of your values. So I think intention setting is probably, one effective way. Well, any questions? It need not necessarily be connected to what I said. You could ask about my life, about His Holiness. Diana, yeah.
Yes. Did you talk about the relationship between understanding wisdom and how it supports and promotes compassion, and understanding compassion helps and supports the function of wisdom?
I haven't really used the word wisdom that much in the book, because when you bring compassion and wisdom together, it has a very strong Buddhist flavor. So So I've used word more like insights and understanding and perception. So it is true that, for example, even for our natural compassion to arise, you need some awareness of the situation in front of you. So perception, and because perception allows us to empathetically understand what the other person is undergoing. And without that kind of understanding, our compassion is not even triggered. So it's the perception that leads to emotional response, which is the identification and connection with the situation in front of you, which then leads to compassionate wish to see the relief of that suffering. So clearly, how you perceive the world is going to affect whether or not you are. I mean, this is one of the reasons why, when you have very strong tribal rivalry, it's very difficult for members of one tribe to feel compassion to the member of the other tribe, because your perception of the world doesn't allow you to make a connection with the other members of the other tribes. So perception and compassion and understanding, they're really intertwined. Yeah, there's a very close friend of mine from Cambridge who happens to be living here, Satanya, and she's in crutches, so we need compassion for her. Yeah. I don't agree there is very little compassion, but I think for most of us, our compassion, we tend to reserve it to a very small circle of people. And also, the thing is, especially with the city life, there's just so many people around, and the kind of the perception of the need that you see around is so enormous, you kind of feel powerless. And that is probably one of the reasons why we switch off. We kind of instinctively divert our attention. But I don't agree that there is less compassion, but unfortunately, what is the case is that quite often, for most of us, our love for our immediate circle, our strong identification with that group tends to come at the cost of having a more antagonistic attitude towards the other. And this is where, I don't know if we are by nature designed to be able to really extend our compassion for all beings. Of course, Buddhism advocates it, and I genuinely believe that it is possible, but I think it's a tall order. And this is where you really need kind of a cultivation. And the ideal situation, if we don't take into account the specific Buddhist perspective, is to be able to develop our mind to a point, or heart to a point, where if it is suffering that is in front of you, whose suffering it is should not matter. This is what we want to get at. Being able to feel compassion for the whole world is a challenge. But I think we can train our heart to a point where the suffering in front of us, regardless of whose suffering it is, can really make us feel compassion and do something. So that's the goal of compassion training. Yeah, Paul.
I just thought that it would be nice if you would explain. His Holiness often says that when he feels depressed, it's compassion that cheers him up.
Yeah.
So that's kind of counterintuitive, because we would expect thinking about others' suffering and wanting to, and seeing them out of it would make you more depressed.
Yes.
So could you explain that, how he means that?
His Holiness has often pointed out that, when you allow your compassion to express, because we all have natural capacity for compassion, it's a question of whether we allow it to be expressed or not. So when you allow your compassion to be expressed, he is saying that it automatically opens our heart. And when we open our heart, there is a kind of an element of courage in this, because we are, in some sense, reaching out. We are opening ourselves, we are reaching out, we are extending, and there is an element of courage. And this is why, your own problem then begins to kind of fade because the sense of proportion completely changes. And he says that when we are, on the other hand, if we are more self-focused, then even a tiny problem becomes enormous, unbearable. And, because then our vision becomes so narrow and we get fixated on this, whereas when we are able to open ourselves and feel compassion for others, it's a kind of a paradox. Because there is even in Shantideva's text, there is a line which says, why should I cultivate compassion and take on more suffering when I already have a lot of pain? And this was a serious question. And Shantideva responds, of course, but it's a paradox. One would expect. And at Stanford, I cite this study in the book. It was very interesting. We had undergraduates. They were exposed to a compassionate phrase telling what compassion means. And then they were asked to extend compassion to visual images of people's faces. And of course, it was more easy to extend compassion to a sad face, suffering pain. And then they were asked not to extend compassion to specific types of faces. After some practices, and then we take a break, and then they were shown these faces very fast, that you can't consciously recognize that you've seen it, and then followed by images of modern art. And they were asked to rate from 1 to 5 how much they liked it. Amazingly, those modern art images that were shown immediately after a face to which they had extended compassion, they rated them much more positively. It's a complete paradox, because one would think that if you're thinking about other people's suffering, you would be kind of feeling really sorry and horrible. That's not the case. And also we know, for example, like when we're able to do something kind to someone, when we're able to help someone, it really elevates us. We feel that. So that's an interesting paradox of human nature.
Thank you very much. So I think that's
yeah.
And we want to thank you for opening your heart to everyone with this wonderful book.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.